A black girl is removed from first class just to make white passengers more comfortable. She's only 13, alone, and humiliated in front of the entire plane. No one defends her, not the crew, not the passengers. But then, she makes one quiet phone call. And when they find out who her father really is, the airline CEO, the entire flight is turned upside down. Why was she targeted in the first place? And what happens when the system that failed her is forced to answer for it? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ava Monroe stood in front of her bedroom mirror, double-checking her reflection one last time. Her navy blue blazer sat perfectly straight on her shoulders, just the way her grandmother had taught her. The early morning sun peeked through her window, casting a warm glow across her carefully chosen outfit. She smoothed down her pressed white shirt and adjusted the small pearl earrings, a birthday gift from her father. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" Daniel Monroe's voice carried from the hallway. He appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his usual crisp suit despite it being Saturday morning. "Yes, Dad," Ava replied, picking up her small carry-on suitcase. She had packed it herself the night before, making sure everything was neatly folded and organized. The drive to JFK was quiet, with only the soft hum of their car's engine filling the space. Ava watched the city wake up through the tinted windows, seeing early morning joggers and coffee shop workers starting their day. Her father occasionally glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his expression thoughtful. Instead of heading to the main terminal, their driver took a different turn, leading them to a separate entrance marked Private Aviation. The building was smaller, more elegant, with none of the usual airport chaos. As they walked through the private terminal's sliding doors, Daniel placed a gentle hand on Ava's shoulder. "Remember what we talked about," he said softly. Ava nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. She'd heard these words many times before. "Stay composed, stay calm," she repeated quietly. "No matter what," Daniel added, his voice carrying a weight that Ava understood all too well. "You're a Monroe. We handle things with dignity." The private terminal was peaceful, with plush seating areas and large windows overlooking the runway. A few business travelers sat scattered around, absorbed in their phones or laptops. Daniel led Ava to the security checkpoint where a TSA agent greeted them with professional courtesy. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe," the agent said, checking their documentation. "And good morning to you, Miss Monroe." Ava smiled politely, just as she'd been taught. She removed her shoes and placed them in the bin along with her blazer, moving through security with practiced ease. Her father watched from the other side, his presence steady and reassuring. After clearing security, they made their way to the first-class waiting area. Daniel checked his watch. "We have about 40 minutes until boarding. Do you have your book?" Ava pulled out her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird from her carry-on. Her grandmother had given it to her last summer, and she was reading it for the third time. "I'll wait until they start boarding," Daniel said, settling into a chair beside her. "Make sure you're safely on board." Ava opened her book, but she couldn't help noticing the subtle glances from other passengers. A businessman did a double take as he walked past, his eyes moving from her to the first-class boarding sign and back again. A woman in designer clothes whispered something to her husband, trying to be discreet but failing. Ava kept her eyes on her book, letting the familiar words of Scout's story wash over her. She sat straight-backed in her chair, her ankles crossed properly, just as her grandmother had shown her. The curious looks continued, but she remained focused on her reading, occasionally turning a page with deliberate calm. The boarding announcement came over the speakers, clear and professional. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are now beginning our priority boarding for Flight 1857 to Atlanta. We invite our first-class passengers to board at this time." Daniel stood, straightening his jacket. "That's you, sweetheart." Ava carefully marked her place in the book and tucked it away. She stood, smoothing her slacks and picking up her carry-on. Her father walked with her to the boarding gate, where a flight attendant waited with a bright smile. "Good morning," the attendant said, scanning Ava's boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Miss Monroe." Ava turned to her father, who gave her a quick hug. "Text me when you land," he said. "Grandmother will be waiting at the private terminal in Atlanta." "I will, Dad," Ava promised, adjusting her grip on her carry-on handle. She walked down the jet bridge with measured steps, her shoes making soft tapping sounds against the floor. At the aircraft door, another flight attendant greeted her warmly, gesturing toward the front of the cabin. The first-class cabin was quiet and spacious with only 8 seats in total. Ava found her seat, 1A, right by the window. She stored her carry-on in the overhead bin, taking care to place it neatly, before settling into the wide leather seat. As she buckled her seatbelt, she could feel the energy in the cabin shift as other passengers began boarding. A man in a business suit paused briefly when he saw her, then continued to his seat further back. 2 women engaged in quiet conversation stopped mid-sentence as they passed her row. Ava turned her attention to the window, watching the ground crew move efficiently around the plane. She could see her father through the terminal windows, still standing there, watching. She gave him a small wave, and he nodded in return. The cabin gradually filled with the sounds of passengers storing luggage and finding their seats. Ava remained still, her hands folded in her lap, observing the morning activity on the tarmac. She could feel the weight of curious glances, hear the muffled whispers, sense the subtle shifts in the air around her. But she stayed composed, just as she'd promised her father, just as her grandmother had taught her. Through the window's reflection, she caught glimpses of passing passengers, their expressions a mixture of surprise, confusion, and curiosity at seeing a young black girl sitting alone in seat 1A. Ava continued to look out the window, her face calm and unreadable, even as she felt the familiar tension begin to build in the air around her. The cabin's hushed atmosphere was broken only by the soft sounds of rolling carry-on bags and shuffling feet as first-class passengers continued boarding. Ava sat quietly in 1A, her posture perfect, hands folded neatly in her lap. Through the window's reflection, she watched as a man in an expensive charcoal suit approached row 1. He paused briefly when he saw her, his eyebrows lifting slightly. Checking his boarding pass twice, he settled into 1B beside her. From the corner of her eye, Ava noticed how he shifted his body slightly away from her, creating an invisible barrier between them. She remained still, remembering her father's words about staying composed. The man pulled out his phone, pointedly focusing on his screen while occasionally casting confused, sideways glances at her. Ava could feel his discomfort radiating like heat from a radiator, but she kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral. Behind them in 2A, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer clothes was boarding. She stopped abruptly in the aisle when she saw Ava, her manicured hand clutching her pearls. Her eyes narrowed as she looked from Ava to the first-class cabin marker and back again. "Excuse me," the woman whispered loudly, catching the attention of a passing flight attendant. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried despite her attempt at discretion. "I think there might be some confusion with the seating arrangements." The flight attendant, Ms. Carter, straightened her Navy uniform and nodded with understanding. Her heels clicked purposefully on the cabin floor as she approached Ava's seat. A practiced smile spread across her face, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, sweetie," Ms. Carter said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava reached into her blazer pocket and produced her boarding pass, handling it with careful fingers. She'd already shown it at the gate, but she understood what was happening. Her grandmother had warned her about moments like these. Ms. Carter took the boarding pass, holding it at arm's length as if examining a suspicious document. Her eyes scanned the paper multiple times, her red-painted lips pursing slightly. She didn't scan it with her electronic device as she had done with other passengers' passes. Instead, she studied it with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it over in her hands. "There seems to be some confusion," Ms. Carter said, her voice maintaining its sugary tone but taking on a firmer edge. "This seat is in first class, and I believe you might have wandered into the wrong cabin. Your seat should be in economy." Ava felt her heart beat faster, but her voice remained steady. "This is my seat," she said, quietly but clearly. 1A. It's printed right there on the boarding pass." Ms. Carter's smile tightened, her eyes hardening slightly at Ava's calm resistance. The flight attendant glanced around the cabin, noting the uncomfortable shifts of other passengers who were pretending not to watch the scene unfold. "Now, dear," Ms. Carter continued, her tone becoming more condescending, "these seats are reserved for our premium passengers. I'm sure there's been a mix-up at the gate. Let me help you find your proper seat." "This is my seat," Ava repeated, her voice still composed but firm. She could feel the businessman beside her pretending to be absorbed in his phone, though his screen had gone dark minutes ago. Ms. Carter's smile vanished completely. She raised her hand, catching the attention of another crew member at the front of the cabin. With a subtle head tilt and raised eyebrows, she communicated something unspoken to her colleague, who immediately reached for the cabin phone. Within minutes, 2 airline security officers appeared at the front of the plane. They moved quietly but purposefully toward Ava's seat. The cabin had grown uncomfortably silent, the usual pre-flight chatter dying away as passengers either stared openly or became intensely interested in their phones and magazines. "Miss," one of the security officers said, his voice low but authoritative, "we need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Ava felt a hollow feeling in her stomach, but her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. "Never let them see you break." With steady hands, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. She reached for her carry-on in the overhead bin, but one of the officers had already removed it. The walk through the first-class cabin felt endless. Ava could feel the weight of stairs on her back, could hear the whispered conversations starting up as she passed. The woman in 2A sat back with a satisfied expression, adjusting her pearls as Ava walked by. They moved through the premium economy section and into the main cabin. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher here, the aisle narrower. More passengers looked up as they passed, some with curiosity, others with pity, most quickly averting their eyes when they saw her looking back. Finally, they stopped at row 34 near the back of the plane. The security officer placed her carry-on in the overhead bin, while Ms. Carter, who had followed them back, gestured to the middle seat. "Here you are, dear," Ms. Carter said, her sweet tone restored now that she had achieved her goal. "This is where you'll be more comfortable." Ava slid into the middle seat, wedged between 2 empty spaces that would soon be filled. She buckled her seatbelt mechanically, her movements precise and controlled despite the humiliation burning in her chest. Ms. Carter gave one final satisfied nod before turning on her heel and clicking her way back to the front of the plane. The security officers departed without another word, leaving Ava alone in row 34. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her face composed, even as she felt the curious glances from surrounding passengers. A few rows ahead, a mother quickly shushed her child who was pointing back at Ava. An elderly man across the aisle kept stealing glances at her before looking away guiltily. Ava turned her face toward the small oval window beside her row, though she could only see a sliver of the tarmac from her position. She thought of her seat in 1A, with its wide window and clear view of the sunrise now occupied by someone else. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Stay composed. Stay calm. No matter what." So she did, even as the confusion and hurt threatened to overwhelm her. The cabin continued to fill around her, passengers squeezing past with their bags, some doing double takes when they saw her sitting alone, still dressed in her first-class attire in the middle seat of row 34. But Ava remained still, her face a mask of calm, even as she felt the weight of injustice settle heavily on her shoulders. From her aisle seat in row 26D, Eloise Garrett watched the scene unfold with the practiced eye of someone who had seen this story play out far too many times before. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the armrest slightly tighter as she observed the young girl being escorted down the aisle, flanked by security officers who towered over her small frame. The girl's composure struck Eloise immediately. There was a dignity in the way she carried herself, spine straight, head held high, even as she was marched past rows of staring passengers. The child's face remained carefully neutral, but Eloise recognized the subtle signs of distress, the slightly too rigid posture, the carefully controlled breathing, the way her hands were clasped just a touch too tightly. Eloise noticed everything, the flight attendant's satisfied strut as she followed behind, the way some passengers quickly averted their eyes while others stared openly, the whispers that rippled through the cabin like a disturbing breeze. She saw the businessman in first class who had already returned to his phone, washing his hands of the situation. The pearl-wearing woman in 2A sat back with a self-satisfied air, as if order had been restored to her world. The security officers directed the girl to row 34, near the very back of the plane. Eloise watched as they made a show of storing her carry-on bag, a piece of expensive luggage that looked distinctly out of place in the economy section. The flight attendant's saccharine voice carried down the aisle as she directed the girl to her middle seat, the false sweetness of her tone making Eloise's teeth ache. With practiced discretion, Eloise reached for her phone. She had learned long ago the importance of documentation. Without drawing attention to herself, she began recording, capturing the aftermath of the incident. The security officer's retreat, the flight attendant's triumphant return to first class, the continued sideways glances from nearby passengers, all of it was preserved in silent digital testimony. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 13, settled into her assigned middle seat with remarkable poise. She placed her small personal item under the seat in front of her with careful precision, folded her hands in her lap, and fixed her gaze straight ahead. But Eloise could see the slight tremor in those folded hands, the way the girl's chest rose and fell with deliberately measured breaths. 2 more passengers arrived to claim their seats on either side of the girl. A heavy-set man squeezed into the window seat, while a woman with oversized headphones took the aisle seat, both doing their best to pretend this was a normal seating arrangement. The girl made herself smaller, trying to minimize contact with her seatmates' encroaching elbows. Eloise continued recording as other passengers filed past, capturing their reactions. A young mother hurriedly redirected her curious child's pointing finger. An elderly man across the aisle kept stealing furtive glances at the girl before guiltily looking away. A teenage boy 2 rows ahead turned around repeatedly, phone in hand, until his father noticed and made him face forward. After several minutes, the girl reached for her phone with steady hands. Eloise watched as she navigated to her contacts and selected one labeled Dad. The girl's voice was soft but clear as she spoke into the phone. "They moved me to the back. Said my seat wasn't valid." There was a pause as she listened to the response. "1A," she answered simply. Another brief pause, then a single word from the other end that Eloise could hear even from her position. "Wait." The call ended abruptly, leaving the girl staring at her silent phone. Eloise stopped recording and leaned forward slightly in her seat. She had seen enough. The familiar pattern was complete. The assumption of guilt, the lack of proper verification, the casual cruelty dressed up as procedure. She had experienced it herself more times than she cared to count, but seeing it happen to someone so young made her blood boil with a quiet rage. "They didn't even check your name, did they?" Eloise asked, her voice low but carrying clearly to row 34. The girl turned slightly, meeting Eloise's eyes. There was recognition there, not of Eloise specifically, but of someone who understood, someone who knew. "No," she replied softly. "Typical," Eloise responded, the single word carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences. The girl held Eloise's gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. In that brief exchange, volumes were spoken without words, shared understanding, quiet solidarity, and the unspoken recognition that this moment, like so many before it, would not go unnoticed or undocumented. Around them, the cabin continued its pre-flight routine. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. The safety demonstration began playing on the screens, but in rows 26 and 34, time seemed to stand still as 2 generations of experience connected across the space between them, linked by an all-too-familiar thread of injustice. Eloise kept her phone ready in her lap, the recording safely stored. She had learned long ago that in moments like these, documentation was power, evidence was protection, and sometimes, the simple act of bearing witness could be its own form of resistance. The girl sat quietly in her middle seat, still maintaining her composure, still breathing steadily, still holding herself with dignity. But now there was something different in her posture, a subtle shift that suggested she knew she wasn't alone in this moment, that someone else saw and understood exactly what had happened. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane prepared for departure. In the artificial twilight, Eloise watched as the girl pulled out a book from her bag, a thick volume that spoke of an intelligence beyond her years. Even in this forced relegation to the back of the plane, she carried herself with a grace that made Eloise's heart ache with both pride and anger. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet. Passengers shifted in their seats, checking phones and watches as the minutes ticked by with no movement from the aircraft. The usual pre-takeoff bustle had faded into restless waiting. Overhead bins creaked occasionally as people adjusted their belongings, and the low murmur of confused conversations filled the pressurized air. In row 34, Ava sat perfectly still between her two seatmates, her book open but unread in her lap. She maintained the same composed posture her father had taught her, even as the man beside her dozed off, his elbow encroaching on her limited space. The woman on her other side kept adjusting her headphones, accidentally bumping Ava's shoulder each time. Eloise remained vigilant from her seat in row 26, her phone still within easy reach. She noticed how other passengers were beginning to fidget and complain, checking their watches with increasing frequency. The delay was unusual, especially for a morning flight. The cabin temperature seemed to rise with the collective anxiety of delayed travelers. Ms. Carter and her fellow flight attendants moved through the cabin with stiff efficiency, their earlier confidence now tinged with an edge of nervousness. They avoided eye contact with passengers who tried to ask about the delay, offering only practiced smiles and vague reassurances about just a few more minutes. The businessman in 1B had loosened his tie and was speaking in harsh whispers into his phone about missed connections. The woman in 2A repeatedly pressed her call button, only to be ignored by the passing flight attendants. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense with each passing minute. Suddenly, the cabin speakers crackled to life. The captain's voice came through, clear and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Please remain seated. There's been a change in crew staffing. We'll have a brief delay as our new attendants board." The announcement sparked a wave of confused murmurs throughout the cabin. Passengers exchanged questioning looks, and several pulled out their phones to text updates to waiting friends and family. The businessman in first class sat up straighter, his own phone forgotten in his hand. Before the whispers could build into anything more substantial, the forward cabin door opened. 2 airport security officers entered, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professional but stern. They moved with purposeful steps directly to the front of the aircraft, where Ms. Carter and her colleagues stood in the galley area. The security officers spoke in low tones that didn't carry past the first few rows, but their body language was clear and commanding. Ms. Carter's face drained of color as she listened. Her perfectly maintained smile crumbled at the edges, replaced by a look of disbelief that quickly morphed into resignation. Without any announcement or explanation to the passengers, the officers escorted Ms. Carter and 2 other crew members toward the exit. Ms. Carter's shoulders were rigid as she walked past the first-class seats where, not long ago, she had questioned Ava's right to sit. She kept her eyes forward, avoiding the curious stares of the passengers. The cabin fell into complete silence as the 3 flight attendants disappeared through the forward door. The security officers followed them out, leaving the remaining passengers in a state of confused anticipation. The only sounds were the distant rumble of other aircraft and the soft hum of the cabin's air circulation system. Minutes later, a new crew boarded the plane. They moved efficiently through the cabin, taking their positions with quiet professionalism. There was no dramatic entrance, no explanation offered, just the smooth assumption of duties by the replacement team. They began their pre-flight checks with calm precision, as if this were any ordinary departure. The new flight attendants carried themselves with a different energy, more focused on their tasks than on the passengers' faces, more concerned with safety procedures than social assumptions. They moved through the cabin with practiced ease, checking seatbelts and overhead bins without any of the previous crew's underlying tension. The cabin had just begun to settle into this new rhythm when the captain himself appeared in the forward galley. He was a tall man with graying temples and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades in the cockpit. Instead of returning to the flight deck, however, he turned and walked purposefully down the aisle. Passengers watched curiously as he made his way through first class, past the premium seats, and continued into the economy section. He moved with intention, his eyes focused ahead until he reached row 34. There he stopped and leaned down slightly. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearby. Ava stood up carefully, maneuvering past her dozing seatmate without disturbing him. She smoothed her skirt and faced the captain, her expression carefully neutral despite the dozens of eyes now fixed on her. The captain didn't offer any explanation. He simply gestured for her to follow him, his movement both professional and courteous. As Ava stepped into the aisle, the captain waited for her to gather her belongings before leading the way forward. Their walk up the aisle became a moment of silent theater. Every passenger watched as the young girl followed the captain, her steps measured and dignified. Those who had witnessed her earlier removal now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others who hadn't seen the initial incident looked on with curious expressions, trying to piece together the story behind this unusual procession. In first class, the businessman in 1B suddenly became very interested in his phone screen, his fingers tapping without purpose as Ava approached. The woman in 2A turned her face toward the window, her reflection in the plexiglass showing her pinched expression. The captain led Ava to seat 1A, her original seat, the one she had been forced to leave earlier. There, placed carefully on her seat tray, was a small folded card. Ava picked it up and read the simple message written inside. "You belong here, always did." She took her seat by the window without comment or celebration. Her movements were precise as she stored her bag, fastened her seatbelt, and settled into position. She didn't look at the other first-class passengers or acknowledge the stares still following her from the rest of the cabin. Instead, she turned to the window, her reflection in the glass showing the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. The cabin air felt different now as Ava settled back into seat 1A. The leather was still warm from when she'd first sat there, but something had shifted in the atmosphere around her. The usual pre-flight chatter had dimmed to whispers and careful glances that darted away the moment she turned her head. Next to her, the businessman in 1B shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his Italian leather shoes scraping against the carpet. He cleared his throat twice, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers, before casting a sideways glance at Ava. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, then closed again. He returned to staring at his phone, though the screen remained dark. The woman in 2A had turned completely toward her window, her spine so straight it barely touched the seat back. Her reflection in the plexiglass showed tightly pressed lips and eyes that seemed determined not to blink. Her manicured fingers gripped the armrest with unnecessary force, knuckles white against the dark leather. A gentle chime sounded through the cabin as the new crew began their pre-flight preparations. The first flight attendant who passed through first class was a woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun. She moved with practiced grace, checking overhead bins with efficient movements. When she reached Ava's row, she paused. "Can I get you anything before takeoff, Miss Monroe?" she asked, her voice carrying just the right balance of professional courtesy and genuine warmth. There was no trace of doubt in her tone, no questioning glance at the seat assignment, no hesitation in addressing Ava directly. "No, thank you," Ava replied quietly, maintaining the composed demeanor her father had instilled in her. The flight attendant nodded with a small smile and continued her checks. As she moved through the cabin, she treated each passenger with the same level of professional courtesy. No more, no less. The stark contrast between her behavior and that of the previous crew hung in the air like an unspoken lesson. Another flight attendant, a younger man with kind eyes, passed through with the pre-flight beverage service. He placed a crisp white napkin on Ava's tray table with the same careful attention he showed to every other first-class passenger. When he offered her a choice of drinks, his voice carried no trace of surprise or judgment, just simple, straightforward service. Back in economy, Eloise maintained her vigilant watch. Her phone remained steady in her hand, partially concealed by a magazine but still recording. Her eyes tracked each interaction, each movement, each subtle shift in the cabin's dynamics. She noticed how the new crew moved through their duties with deliberate professionalism, their behavior a silent rebuke to what had happened earlier. The businessman in 1B accepted his pre-flight water with trembling fingers, some of it sloshing onto his napkin as he took a quick sip. The The woman in 2A declined any service, her words barely audible as she continued her determined study of the tarmac outside. More passengers filed past on their way to economy, their curious glances at Ava growing shorter and less frequent as they encountered her unwavering composure. Some looked away quickly, perhaps reminded of their own silence during her earlier removal. Others seemed to study their boarding passes with sudden intensity as they passed her row. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for the safety demonstration. The familiar announcement began to play through the speakers, and the flight attendants took their positions in the aisles. As Ava adjusted her tray table to its upright position, her fingers brushed against something tucked into the side slot, a small envelope she hadn't noticed before. With careful movements, she slipped the envelope free. It was made of heavy cream-colored paper, the kind used for formal invitations or important messages. The envelope was sealed but unmarked, giving no hint of its contents or sender. Ava opened it quietly, taking care not to tear the paper. Inside was a handwritten card, the message written in elegant blue ink. "You belong here. Always did." She studied the words for a moment, her expression unchanged. There was no visible reaction to the message. No smile touched her lips, no tears welled in her eyes. With the same careful composure she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, she reached down for her backpack beneath the seat. The zipper made a soft sound as she opened it, barely audible over the safety demonstration still playing through the cabin speakers. She tucked the card securely inside, between the pages of her book, and zipped the bag closed again. Then she returned to her original position, facing straight ahead, her posture perfect, and her expression serene. The businessman in 1B pretended to be absorbed in the safety card, though his eyes hadn't moved across the page in several minutes. The woman in 2A had finally turned slightly away from the window, but her gaze remained fixed somewhere in the middle distance, deliberately avoiding any contact with her row neighbors. Around them, the new crew continued their pre-flight duties with quiet efficiency. Their actions spoke volumes, treating Ava's presence in first class as completely natural and unremarkable, exactly as it should have been from the start. They moved through the cabin with a dignity that seemed to echo Ava's own composed demeanor. From her seat in economy, Eloise continued her silent documentation, her phone capturing these final moments before takeoff. She watched as Ava sat perfectly still in seat 1A, neither celebrating her return nor acknowledging the discomfort of those around her. The young girl's dignity in the face of both injustice and its correction told its own powerful story. The safety demonstration concluded, and the cabin lights returned to their normal brightness. The flight attendants began their final checks, moving through the aisles with practiced efficiency. Through it all, Ava remained motionless in her seat, facing forward, her expression unchanged. She neither sought attention nor shied away from it. She simply existed in the space that had always been rightfully hers. As the plane climbed steadily into the morning sky, Eloise Garrett leaned back in her economy seat, letting her eyes close for just a moment. Behind her closed lids, the scenes from the past hour played like a carefully edited film. The quiet dignity of young Ava Monroe, the casual cruelty of the original crew, the swift intervention that followed, and the telling discomfort of the first-class passengers who had witnessed it all in silence. Opening her eyes, Eloise reached for her phone again, her manicured fingers moving with practiced precision across the screen. She had done this many times before, documenting, recording, preserving these moments that others might prefer to forget. With methodical attention to detail, she began typing, date, Saturday, June 15th. Flight, Delta 1382. Departure, JFK to ATL. Initial incident, time, 8:45 a.m. Crew removal, 9:05 a.m. Captain's intervention, 9:15 a.m. Her fingers paused briefly as she considered the exact timing of events, wanting to ensure every detail was accurate. This wasn't just note-taking, it was creating a record, a testament to what had transpired. She added specific details about the flight attendants involved, their approximate ages, their behavior, and the exact words they had used when confronting Ava. The woman seated beside her, a middle-aged passenger in a floral blouse, had been stealing glances at Eloise's phone screen for the past few minutes. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. "Are you texting the news?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and concern. Her eyes darted between Eloise's phone and her face, eager for confirmation. Without looking up from her screen, Eloise continued typing as she replied, "No, just keeping receipts." Her voice was calm but carried a weight of experience, suggesting this wasn't her first time documenting such an incident. The woman shifted in her seat, clearly wanting to ask more questions, but something in Eloise's focused demeanor made her think better of it. She returned to her magazine, though her attention seemed more focused on trying to catch glimpses of what Eloise was writing. From her vantage point in row 26, Eloise had a clear view of much of the cabin. She observed the subtle but significant changes in the atmosphere since takeoff. The first-class section, usually a haven of comfortable privilege, now seemed charged with an uncomfortable energy. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident were notably tense, their bodies rigid in their seats, their conversations muted or non-existent. The businessman in 1B had loosened his tie slightly, and his hand shook visibly as he lifted his water glass to his lips. The woman in 2A had finally turned away from the window, but now seemed intensely focused on her magazine, though she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Other first-class passengers cast furtive glances toward seat 1A, their expressions a mix of guilt, discomfort, and something that looked like shame. Eloise noted these details too, her fingers moving steadily across her phone screen. Post-incident behavior. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the subtle shift in engine noise barely noticeable over the heavy silence that seemed to blanket the cabin. The new flight attendants moved through their service routine with quiet efficiency, their treatment of Ava notably natural and professional, exactly as it should have been from the start. Eloise continued her documentation, adding timestamps and specific details about the replacement crew's behavior. Her observations were precise, clinical almost, but beneath the professional tone of her notes lay a deeper understanding of what these moments meant. She had seen this scene play out before, in different settings, with different faces, but always with the same underlying current of systemic bias, followed by uncomfortable silence. Shifting slightly in her seat, Eloise leaned toward the aisle, adjusting her position until she could see past the rows of seats ahead. Her eyes found Ava, still sitting perfectly straight in seat 1A, her gaze fixed on the clouds outside her window. The morning sun caught the young girl's profile, illuminating her composed features and the quiet strength in her posture. In that moment, Eloise saw herself from decades ago, a younger version who had faced similar moments of being silenced but never truly invisible. She recognized the careful composure, the deliberate dignity, the silent strength that spoke volumes without saying a word. It was a familiar reflection, one that stretched across generations of similar experiences. The sight stirred something deep within Eloise, but her fingers remained steady as she made her final notes. Each tap on her phone screen felt like another piece of evidence preserved, another moment captured for the record. This wasn't just about one incident on one flight. It was about patterns, about systems, about the quiet moments of injustice that often went undocumented. With a sense of completion, Eloise tapped the save button on her phone, watching as the document was secured in her digital archives. She placed the phone carefully in her lap, the action carrying a quiet finality. The device lay there like a silent witness, containing within its memory the detailed account of what had transpired that morning, a record that couldn't be dismissed or denied. The woman next to her had given up trying to see what Eloise was writing, but her curiosity remained evident in the way she fidgeted with her magazine pages. Around them, the cabin continued its uneasy silence, broken only by the steady hum of the engines and the occasional clink of ice in a glass from first class. Through it all, Ava remained at her window, neither seeking attention nor hiding from it, simply existing in the space that had always rightfully been hers. From her seat in economy, Eloise watched over her with the quiet vigilance of someone who understood exactly what this moment meant and why it needed to be remembered. In his spacious corner office on the top floor of Auralis Air's corporate headquarters, Daniel Monroe stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosted against the Manhattan skyline. His fingers were pressed against the cool glass as he waited for the secure line to connect. The morning sun cast long shadows across his desk, where multiple screens displayed real-time flight data and company metrics. The moment the connection clicked through to the operations team, Daniel's voice cut through any preliminary greetings. Emergency crew removal triggered. Flight 86, JFK to ATL. His tone was measured but carried an underlying steel that his team recognized immediately. The operations center responded with practiced efficiency. Yes, sir. Confirmation received at 0905. Replacement crew already dispatched. There was a brief pause, followed by keyboard clicks. They're boarding now. Daniel moved away from the window, his polished shoes silent against the thick carpet. He settled into his leather chair, eyes fixed on the center screen where Flight 86's status blinked steadily. Walk me through it. Initial alert came through the captain's emergency channel, the lead operator explained. Crew removal protocol was activated immediately. Security teams were already on standby. They're escorting the original crew members off now. Any pushback? Daniel's question was precise. None, sir. They're complying with the removal order. Daniel's hand rested on his mouse, clicking through various system alerts. The replacement crew? Already briefed and boarding. Captain Roberts is personally handling the situation. There was another flutter of keyboard activity. All proceeding according to protocol, sir. Access to the incident report? Daniel's voice remained steady, but his free hand had curled into a loose fist on his desk. Coming through now, sir. It's still in draft form. The crew filed it just before removal. Daniel's screen refreshed and the preliminary incident report appeared. His eyes moved methodically through the carefully worded document. Incident report. Flight 86. Status draft. Time. 0845. Location. First class cabin. Nature of incident. Passenger mismatch. Details. Unaccompanied minor in incorrect cabin. Additional notes. Passenger refused relocation. The muscles in Daniel's jaw tightened as he read through the sanitized language, recognizing the careful construction of plausible deniability. Each word had been chosen to obscure rather than illuminate, to protect rather than expose. I wrote the protocol they're trying to manipulate, he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made the operations team fall silent. His fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up additional documentation. I designed these procedures to protect passengers, not to provide cover for discrimination. The operations center remained quiet, waiting for his next move. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his reflection in the computer screen showing the same composed expression he always maintained in board meetings. But there was something different in his eyes now, a cold clarity that came from personal stakes rather than professional ones. Trigger an immediate internal flag, he directed, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable authority. I want a full review of crew language usage across all flights for the past 6 months. Focus on passenger interaction reports, removal requests, and seating disputes. His fingers moved across the keyboard again. Cross-reference with passenger demographics. Yes, sir. Setting up the analysis parameters now. Daniel continued. Pull the audio from today's incident. I want it isolated and tagged for review. He paused, then added, and flag any similar incidents from the past quarter. Look for patterns in crew assignments and passenger complaints. The operations team worked quickly, the sound of rapid typing coming through the secure line. Review protocols initiated, sir. Data collection beginning now. As Daniel watched the various systems activate, a new alert flashed across his screen. It was a real-time update from Flight 86. Passenger in Seat 1A. Status normalized. He knew what it meant. Ava was back where she belonged. He closed his laptop with a quiet but definitive click. Standing up, he moved to the small bar cart in the corner of his office and poured a glass of water. The morning sun had climbed higher now, filling the office with clear light that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. This time, he said quietly, holding the glass but not drinking, they picked the wrong kid. The operations team remained silent on the other end of the line, aware that their CEO's words weren't meant for them. They were a statement of fact, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly what mechanisms needed to be set in motion. The water in Daniel's glass caught the sunlight, casting small rainbows on his desk. He stood there, motionless, as the various systems he had just activated began their work, gathering data, tracking patterns, building the foundation for what would come next. The morning city sprawled out below his window, unaware of the quiet but significant changes being set in motion from this high-rise office. The descent into Atlanta was gentle, the plane's wings tilting slightly as it navigated through scattered clouds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cabin, creating a peaceful atmosphere that belied the earlier tension. Ava sat perfectly still in seat 1A, her posture as composed as it had been during takeoff. Her book remained unopened in her lap, her attention focused on the approaching cityscape below. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, collecting trash and ensuring seats were upright. When they reached Ava's row, they treated her with a careful politeness that seemed almost apologetic. She acknowledged their presence with only the slightest nod, not out of rudeness, but from a place of quiet dignity. She wasn't being cold. She had simply said all she needed to say. Through the window, Atlanta's sprawl came into clearer view. Office buildings caught the sunlight, their windows flashing like signals. Highways wound between them like rivers of concrete, filled with cars that looked like toys from this height. Ava watched it all with steady eyes, her reflection in the window showing the same composed expression she'd maintained throughout the flight. The landing gear descended with a mechanical whir, and the cabin fell into the familiar routine of final approach. Seatbelt signs chimed, tray tables clicked shut, and passengers shifted in their seats, preparing for touchdown. Through it all, Ava remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her breathing calm and measured. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and the plane rolled smoothly along the runway. As they taxied to the gate, the cabin came alive with the usual sounds of arrival, phones being turned on, overhead bins being opened prematurely, the rustle of passengers gathering their belongings. Ava didn't move, waiting patiently as the aircraft came to a complete stop. When the seatbelt sign finally turned off, the cabin filled with the familiar chaos of deplaning. Passengers stood up, reaching for bags, checking phones, and forming the inevitable queue in the aisle. Ava remained seated, knowing there was no rush. Her spot in first class meant she could take her time. As people filed past, their glances told different stories. Some passengers looked at her with awkward smiles, their discomfort evident in their quick attempts at friendliness. Others hurried by, their eyes fixed straight ahead, carrying their own guilt or embarrassment about what they had witnessed. A few simply looked curious, perhaps wondering about the young girl who had caused such a stir. The businessman from seat 1B gathered his briefcase from the overhead bin. He paused, adjusting his tie, and looked at Ava with an expression that seemed to be searching for the right words. Finally, he managed, "Have a good visit." His voice carried a hint of apology, though for what exactly? His silence during the incident, his initial skepticism, or the broader situation, wasn't clear. Ava didn't respond, her gaze remaining fixed ahead. She had no obligation to ease his conscience. The woman from 2A hurried past without a word, her shoulders tense, her steps quick. She had spent the entire flight avoiding eye contact, and her exit maintained that pattern. Other first-class passengers followed, each carrying their own version of discomfort as they passed. As the cabin slowly emptied, Eloise made her way up from economy. She moved with deliberate grace, her elegant bearing unchanged from earlier. When she reached Ava's row, she paused. Unlike the others, her presence carried no awkwardness, no attempt at retroactive kindness. Instead, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who recognized a shared experience. "You carry it well," Eloise said, her voice low enough that only Ava could hear. The words weren't delivered with pity or even encouragement. They were simply an acknowledgement, one warrior to another. Ava looked up at her for the first time. "Carry what?" The weight of being underestimated. Eloise's response came with a knowing look, her eyes holding Ava's for a moment before she continued down the aisle. The exchange lingered in the air as Ava finally stood, reaching for her carry-on bag. She moved with unhurried precision, checking that she hadn't left anything behind. The envelope with its handwritten note was safely tucked in her backpack, a quiet reminder of both the day's injustice and its resolution. The jet bridge was empty by the time she stepped off the plane. Her footsteps echoed slightly as she walked toward the terminal, the sound steady and purposeful. The gate area was busy with the usual airport activity. People rushing to connections, families reuniting, business travelers checking phones. Ava scanned the crowd, looking for her grandmother's familiar face. Instead, her eyes fell on a uniformed Oralis air driver standing near the security checkpoint. He held a sign that read simply, A. Monroe, in professional lettering. It was exactly like her father to arrange this. Efficient, protective, and leaving nothing to chance. The driver's presence was both a comfort and a statement. She was meant to be treated with respect. Ava approached him with the same quiet confidence she'd maintained throughout the day. The driver recognized her immediately, offering a professional nod as he reached for her carry-on. "Miss Monroe? This way, please." They walked through the terminal in silence, passing shops and restaurants filled with travelers. The driver led her through a less crowded corridor and out to a waiting black car with tinted windows. He opened the door for her with practiced courtesy. As Ava settled into the back seat, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a text from her father. "Talk when you land. You did good." The message was typically brief, typically Daniel. No excess emotion, no dramatic declarations. Just like the note on her seat, it said exactly what was needed, nothing more. Ava put the phone away without replying. Words weren't necessary right now. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, merging into the airport traffic. Through the tinted windows, Atlanta passed by in a blur of buildings and trees. Ava watched the city slide past, her reflection in the window showing the same composed expression she'd worn all day. She hadn't broken, hadn't given anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She had simply existed in a space they thought wasn't hers, and in doing so had changed something fundamental about that space itself. The black car pulled up to Miss Thelma's historic Victorian home in the West End of Atlanta, just as the late afternoon sun painted the sky in warm amber tones. The house stood proud with its wraparound porch and carefully tended garden, a testament to generations of care and dignity. The driver helped Ava with her bag, setting it gently on the brick pathway that led to the front steps. Miss Thelma appeared in the doorway before Ava could reach for the brass knocker. She stood tall and elegant in a flowing caftan, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat twist. Her eyes, sharp and knowing despite her 70-plus years, took in every detail of her granddaughter's appearance. "There's my girl," Miss Thelma said, opening her arms wide. Her voice carried the warmth of summer honey, touched with the slight raspiness of age. Ava walked into her grandmother's embrace, letting herself be enveloped in the familiar scent of vanilla extract and lavender. Miss Thelma's hugs were always firm and purposeful, never half-hearted. But as she held her granddaughter close, she felt something in Ava's posture, a certain stiffness that hadn't been there before. "Let me look at you," Miss Thelma said, holding Ava at arm's length. Her keen eyes noticed the too straight set of Ava's shoulders, the careful blankness of her expression. It was a look she recognized all too well, the face of someone who had learned to wear dignity like armor. The house welcomed them with the aroma of Miss Thelma's cooking, the rich smell of pot roast and herbs, fresh cornbread, and something sweet baking in the oven. The entryway's hardwood floors gleamed in the late afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows, and family photos lined the walls in elegant frames. "Go on up and freshen up," Miss Thelma said, patting Ava's shoulder. "Dinner's almost ready." Ava climbed the familiar stairs to the guest room that had always been hers during visits. The room remained unchanged, pale blue walls, white eyelet curtains, and a quilted bedspread that Miss Thelma had made herself. She set her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the intricate stitching of the quilt. The familiar pattern usually brought comfort, but today her fingers just traced the lines mechanically. When Ava came down for dinner, Miss Thelma had set the formal dining room table with her best china, the ones with delicate blue flowers around the edges. A crystal water glass stood at each place setting, catching the light from the chandelier above. It was more formal than their usual setup, but Miss Thelma believed in marking occasions, even difficult ones, with proper respect. They sat across from each other, Miss Thelma at the head of the table where she'd presided for decades. She watched as Ava picked at her food, moving pieces of perfectly tender pot roast around her plate. The cornbread, usually Ava's favorite, remained untouched. "Was the flight smooth?" Miss Thelma asked finally, her voice casual but her eyes intent. Ava's fork paused mid-motion. She set it down carefully beside her plate, the movement precise and controlled. A long moment passed before she spoke. "They moved me," she said quietly, "then put me back." The words hung in the air between them. Miss Thelma didn't need details to understand. She'd lived through enough decades to recognize the shape of what had happened, to feel the weight of history in those simple words. "You held your head up?" Miss Thelma asked, though it wasn't really a question. She could see the answer in her granddaughter's bearing. Ava looked up then, meeting her grandmother's gaze directly. "I didn't have a choice." Miss Thelma nodded slowly, understanding flowing between them like a current. She'd carried that same weight in her youth, had learned to navigate spaces that tried to deny her presence. She saw in Ava's composed face the same quiet strength she'd had to cultivate, the dignity that became both shield and statement. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, the kind that can exist only between people who understand each other completely. Miss Thelma didn't push for more details, didn't offer platitudes or outrage. She simply served Ava an extra helping of peach cobbler still warm from the oven and let her eat in peace. Later that night, Ava lay in bed, the soft cotton sheets cool against her skin. The street outside was quiet except for the occasional car passing and the distant sound of crickets. Through her window, she could see the moon hanging low and full in the Georgia sky, casting silver light across her quilt. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind kept returning to the flight, replaying each moment with crystal clarity. She saw Ms. Carter's face, that practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes as she explained why Ava needed to move, the false sweetness in her voice when she said, "I'm sure there's been a mistake, dear," as if she were doing Ava a favor by correcting an obvious error. The memory of the first-class cabin's silence pressed against her consciousness, the businessman in 1B glancing away when she looked in his direction, the woman in 2A whispering to the flight attendant with such certainty that something was wrong, their faces when she returned to her rightful seat, the awkward attempts at friendliness that came too late. Ava remembered her own stillness throughout it all, the careful way she had maintained her composure, never raising her voice, never showing a crack in her calm exterior. She had done exactly what her father had prepared her for, had handled it exactly as she'd been taught. Lying there in the darkness, Ava realized she didn't feel angry. The emotion that filled her wasn't rage or even resentment. Instead, she felt alert, aware, as if her senses had been heightened by the experience. It wasn't exhaustion that kept her awake, but a new kind of consciousness, a deeper understanding of the world and her place in it. She watched the shadows of tree branches dance across her ceiling, cast by the moonlight and stirred by a gentle breeze. The familiar patterns seemed different now, more significant somehow. Like everything else, they had taken on new meaning in the wake of today's events. The glass-walled conference room on the top floor of Auralis Air's corporate headquarters glowed like a beacon in the dark Manhattan skyline. Daniel Monroe sat at the polished mahogany table, his tablet displaying a cascade of incident reports. Across from him, Victoria Chen, VP of Risk and Ethics, methodically arranged papers in precise stacks. The city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but Daniel's focus remained fixed on the screen before him. His voice, when he spoke, carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to maintaining control in difficult situations. "I need the unedited incident report from Flight 86, the original file, not the sanitized version." Victoria's hands stilled over her papers. She studied Daniel's face, noting the subtle tension in his jaw. The preliminary report has already been processed through standard channels. Victoria. Daniel's fingers tapped once on the table. The unedited version. She nodded, understanding the implicit command. Her fingers moved swiftly across her laptop keyboard, accessing secure servers that few in the company could reach. After several moments, she turned the screen toward him. Here's the raw feed, time-stamped from the moment the first flag was raised. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the document. His expression remained neutral, but his shoulders tensed as he read Ms. Carter's initial report. Passenger displayed non-compliant behavior when questioned about seating assignment, refused to provide valid verification of first-class boarding pass. Secondary verification notice triggered due to suspicious booking pattern. His eyes narrowed at the careful construction of lies. The boarding pass had been scanned properly at the gate. He'd verified that himself. Every security checkpoint had been cleared without issue. The suspicious booking pattern was nothing more than his daughter's name on a first-class ticket. "Show me the system flag," he said quietly. Victoria pulled up another screen. The technical data scrolled past until she found what they were looking for, a small red indicator next to Ava's booking information. Secondary verification notice, minor traveler protocol. Run an analysis, Daniel instructed. How many similar flags in the past 6 months? Victoria's fingers moved across the keyboard again. Numbers populated the screen, forming patterns that made Daniel's jaw clench tighter. 14 incidents, all involving unaccompanied minors of color, all triggered by the same verification notice system that was supposed to protect young travelers. Most of these were never escalated, Victoria noted, her voice carefully professional. They were marked as resolved at gate level, or passenger voluntarily relocated. Daniel understood what those euphemisms meant. 14 children had faced what Ava faced. 14 times the system had flagged them as suspicious simply because of who they were. And 14 times it had been handled quietly, buried under polite procedures and professional smiles. He scrolled through the data, noting how each incident had been carefully documented to avoid any appearance of discrimination. The language was always precise, always focused on procedure and protocol. Ms. Carter had simply been following an established pattern, confident that this incident would be buried like all the others. "Pull up Ms. Carter's service record," he said. The file appeared on screen. 20 years of service, multiple commendations for attention to procedure and maintaining cabin standards. No formal complaints, at least none that had made it into her official record. Daniel thought of Ava, sitting silently in economy class, maintaining her composure while adults who should have protected her instead treated her like an intruder. He thought of the other children who had faced similar treatment, whose parents might never have known why their seats were suddenly unavailable. His finger hovered over his tablet screen for a moment before he opened his email. The message he composed was brief. To Margaret Walsh, Chief HR Officer. Subject, Flight 86 Ethics Review. I want the entire crew structure of Flight 86 under ethics review within 48 hours. He hit send without hesitation. Then, with deliberate movements, he navigated through his secure files until he found what he was looking for. A folder labeled Bias Response Infrastructure, Dormant. The project had been started 2 years ago, a comprehensive overhaul of Auralis Air's booking and verification systems. It had been designed to identify and eliminate algorithmic bias, to prevent exactly the kind of glitch that had flagged his daughter. But it had been shelved, deemed too costly, too disruptive to existing procedures. Daniel opened the file, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his eyes. Victoria watched him silently, understanding the significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about one incident or one crew member anymore. This was about systemic change. The night deepened outside the conference room windows, the city lights burning steady against the darkness. Inside, Daniel Monroe began the work of dismantling a system that had failed not just his daughter, but every child who had been quietly moved to the back of the plane, their dignity sacrificed on the altar of procedure. The unedited incident report from Flight 86 remained open on his screen. a testament to how easily injustice could hide behind professional language and policy. But now, it would serve a different purpose, not as something to be buried, but as evidence of why change couldn't wait any longer. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the oak trees of Henderson Park, where elderly men and women gathered in their usual spots. Some hunched over chess tables, their weathered hands hovering over pieces with practiced deliberation. Others sat on benches with well-worn books, their pages softly rustling in the Georgia breeze. The air carried the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms and the gentle murmur of storytellers sharing memories with whoever would listen. Children's laughter occasionally punctuated the peaceful atmosphere as they chased each other along the park's edges, their energy a stark contrast to the deliberate pace of the elders. Miss Thelma led Ava along the winding path, her steps measured and purposeful. She wore a crisp cotton dress in deep purple, her silver hair arranged neatly beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat. Ava walked beside her grandmother in silence, still carrying the weight of yesterday's flight in her shoulders. Her fingers occasionally brushed against the fabric of her light summer dress, a nervous habit she'd developed in childhood. They passed several regular park-goers who nodded respectfully to Miss Thelma. She was known here, her presence as much a part of the park's landscape as the ancient trees themselves. A man playing chess raised his hand in greeting, and Miss Thelma acknowledged him with a gentle tilt of her head. Another woman called out a soft hello, her smile warm with decades of friendship. "This park," Miss Thelma said, her voice rich and smooth like honey, "has been here longer than most of the buildings in Atlanta. These benches have heard more stories than any history book could hold." She gestured toward a nearby oak tree with gnarled roots spreading across the ground. "That tree was already old when I was a girl." She guided Ava to a wooden bench nestled beneath a sprawling oak tree. The wood was smooth from years of use, its green paint faded but well-maintained. They sat together, watching as a group of elderly men debated their next chess moves at a nearby table. One man slapped his knee in frustration, while another chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. Miss Thelma folded her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "Your daddy was about 8 years old when it happened," she began, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone unpacking a delicate memory. "We were coming back from visiting my sister in Montgomery. The bus was crowded, but we'd paid our fares just like everyone else." Her fingers traced the pattern of her dress absently. Ava turned slightly toward her grandmother, recognizing the familiar cadence of a story that needed to be told. The morning light filtered through the leaves above them, creating patterns on the ground at their feet. A squirrel darted across their path, pausing momentarily before scampering up a nearby tree. "A white woman got on at the next stop," Miss Thelma continued. "She looked at me, then at the driver. Didn't say a word herself, didn't have to. The driver came back and told me I needed to move." She paused, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her dress. "Your daddy, he couldn't understand it. He kept saying, 'But Mama, we paid. We paid just like everyone else.' His little face was so confused, so hurt." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. In the distance, someone laughed at a chess player's bold move, but at their bench, the air felt heavy with memory. A fallen leaf spiraled down, landing softly between them. I had to explain it to him later that night. Why we had to get off that bus and wait for the next one. Why paying the same fare didn't mean getting the same treatment. Miss Thelma's voice remained steady, but her hands clasped tighter in her lap. "He thought I was lying. He was 8. He thought the world was fair." She shook her head slightly, the memories playing across her face like shadows. Ava absorbed her grandmother's words, drawing parallels to her own experience in Seat 1A. The same quiet humiliation, the same expectation to move without question, the same assumptions made without a single word spoken. She felt the echo of her father's childhood confusion in her own recent indignity. "And now?" Ava asked softly, though she already knew part of the answer. Her voice barely carried over the ambient sounds of the park. Miss Thelma's lips curved into a smile that held both pride and sadness. "Now he runs the skies. Your daddy took that memory and built something from it. But even he couldn't stop what happened to you." Her weathered hand reached out to cover Ava's, the touch gentle but strong. "He did stop it," Ava said, thinking of how quickly the situation had been corrected once her father was notified. Just not fast enough. She looked down at their joined hands, noticing how similar their fingers were despite the decades between them. Miss Thelma nodded slowly, reaching into her purse. She withdrew a carefully folded napkin, its edges crisp and precise. With deliberate movements, she placed it in Ava's hand. The fabric was soft, yellowed slightly with age, but clearly preserved with care. "Open it," she instructed gently, her eyes watchful and warm. Ava unfolded the napkin carefully. Inside lay a pin, its metal dulled with age but still striking. The design was simple but powerful, the emblem of the Montgomery bus boycott. Ava ran her finger over its surface, feeling the weight of history in such a small object. The metal was cool against her skin, but seemed to warm at her touch. "Keep this," Miss Thelma said, watching her granddaughter examine the pin. "And one day, pass it to the next girl in seat 1A. Her voice held the quiet certainty of someone who understood that history never truly ends, but continues in new forms with each generation. In his Manhattan office, Daniel Monroe sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over his keyboard as he scrolled through internal Oralis communications. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. His coffee, untouched since his assistant brought it an hour ago, had gone cold. The incident report from Flight 86 had sparked a quiet storm within the company. Emails and messages pinged back and forth between departments, each carefully worded but carrying undertones of concern, defense, or deflection. Some defended the crew's actions with corporate speak about standard procedures and safety protocols. Others questioned the sudden crew change but didn't dare speculate openly. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he read through thread after thread. 23 years of corporate experience had taught him to read between the lines, to see the subtle ways people avoided saying what they really meant. But today, those carefully constructed phrases felt like sandpaper against his conscience. A notification popped up on his screen. New message to the internal whistleblower line. Anonymous, as they always were. Daniel clicked it open. This wasn't the first time that crew removed a kid who looked out of place. This time, they picked the CEO's daughter. Daniel sat back in his chair, letting the words sink in. The message was brief, but its implications were vast. He thought about Ava, sitting quietly in that economy seat, carrying herself with a dignity no 13-year-old should have to maintain. His daughter had become a statistic in her own father's airline. He leaned forward and began typing commands into his terminal. The whistleblower system was designed to be anonymous, but as CEO, he had access to certain metadata. He wasn't looking for the sender's identity. He was looking for patterns, previous reports, similar language, timestamps. Within minutes, he found what he was looking for. The same anonymous user had filed 3 previous reports over the past 8 months. Each one detailed instances of subtle discrimination, carefully documented with dates, flight numbers, and specific phrases used by crew members. Each report had been tagged as reviewed, but marked insufficient evidence for action. Daniel dug deeper. The IP addresses led him to a terminal in the customer care department. Cross-referencing login times and shift schedules narrowed it down to a single employee. Maya Chen, entry-level customer care representative hired 11 months ago. He picked up his phone and dialed his HR director. "Send me Maya Chen's file," and set up a private Zoom call with her. Today. An hour later, Daniel sat in front of his laptop, waiting for the call to connect. Maya's face appeared on screen, young, professional, clearly nervous. She wore a simple blue blouse and sat in what looked like her home office. "Ms. Chen," Daniel began, keeping his voice calm and neutral. "Thank you for making time for this call." "Of course, Mr. Monroe," she replied, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Though I'm not sure why." "You know exactly why," he said quietly. "The whistleblower reports. All 4 of them." Maya's face remained composed, but her shoulders tensed slightly. "Sir, those reports are supposed to be anonymous. They still are to everyone except me." Daniel leaned closer to the camera. I'm not here to reprimand you, Ms. Chen. I'm here because I need your help. Quietly. The tension in Maya's shoulders eased slightly, but confusion crossed her face. My help? I want everything, Daniel said, his voice taking on an intensity that made Maya sit up straighter. Language, phrases, codes, patterns. Show me what I've been missing. Maya was silent for a moment, studying his face through the screen. Then she reached for something off camera and pulled out a notebook. I've been keeping track, she said, her voice stronger now. It's not just the obvious things. It's in the way they phrase announcements, the codes they use for passenger assistance, the random selection patterns for additional screening. For the next hour, Maya walked Daniel through her observations. She showed him how certain phrases in crew reports were used to justify discriminatory actions without explicitly stating bias. How passenger appeared confused often meant passenger didn't match our expectations. How routine verification was applied disproportionately to certain passengers. She pulled up screenshots, showed him patterns in scheduling, pointed out how complaints about bias were systematically downgraded in priority. Her documentation was meticulous, her analysis sharp and clear. Why didn't you escalate this further? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. I did, Maya replied quietly. 3 times. Each time I was told the evidence was inconclusive or that I was overinterpreting standard procedures. After a while, you learn to document everything but expect nothing. Daniel nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. Thank you, Ms. Chen. This conversation never happened. But things are going to change. After the call ended, Daniel sat back in his chair, running his hands over his face. The sunlight that had seemed so bright earlier now felt harsh and exposing. He wasn't shaken by what had happened to Ava. He was shaken by how predictable it had been, how many signs he had missed, how many reports he had trusted others to handle, how many Maya Chens had tried to speak up only to be silenced by the very systems he had built. He turned back to his computer and opened the company's internal employee dashboard. His cursor moved to a section of grayed-out positions, roles that had been proposed but never implemented. He found what he was looking for, a position that had been suggested 3 years ago but dismissed as unnecessary given current oversight structures. Daniel clicked on the position. A window opened, asking for executive authorization to activate the role. He entered his credentials and watched as the status changed from gray to green. Passenger Bias Oversight Officer. Status active. The Atlanta afternoon sun cast long shadows through Miss Thelma's living room windows when the doorbell rang. Ava looked up from her book, watching her grandmother make her way to the front door. Through the decorative glass panels, she could see the crisp white uniform of an Airline air courier. Package for Miss Ava Monroe, the courier announced, his voice professional and courteous. Miss Thelma accepted the delivery with a raised eyebrow, signing the electronic pad before bringing the envelope to where Ava sat curled up on the floral-patterned couch. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, made of expensive paper. What caught Ava's attention wasn't the Airline Air logo embossed in the corner, but rather her name written in careful handwriting across the front. Well, Miss Thelma said, settling into her armchair nearby, aren't you going to open it? Ava turned the envelope over in her hands, studying the precise folds and the way the afternoon light caught the raised lettering of the company logo. She'd seen enough of her father's business correspondence to recognize quality stationery, but this felt different, personal somehow. With careful fingers, she broke the seal and pulled out the contents. The first thing she saw was the official letterhead. Stark black against white paper, the Airline Air logo prominent at the top. The letter was typed in a clean, professional font, Re Flight 86, JFK to ATL Crew Behavior Review. This letter serves to acknowledge that the events of Flight 86 have been formally logged as a policy violation within our internal review system. A comprehensive crew behavior assessment has been initiated in accordance with company standards and protocols. The incident has been documented and will be used to inform future training and policy implementation. Regards, Human Resources Department, Airline Air. Ava read the words twice, letting them settle in her mind. No apology, no direct acknowledgement of what actually happened. just clean corporate language that danced around the truth, turning her experience into something sanitized and distant, a policy violation rather than what it really was. As she lowered the letter, something else slipped from inside the envelope. A small card, plain white, fell onto her lap. Unlike the official letter, this one was different. Personal. The handwriting was neat but had character, as if someone had taken their time with each word. You didn't raise your voice, but you raised a standard. A friend. Ava picked up the card, reading the words again. They felt different from the corporate letter, warmer, more real. She thought about that day on the plane, how she'd kept her composure even as they'd walked her to the back, how she hadn't argued or made a scene, how she'd simply stated, "This is my seat," and let the truth of those words stand on their own. The house was quiet except for the gentle whir of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of birds in Miss Thelma's garden. Ava reached for her backpack, pulling out the small envelope that held her grandmother's Montgomery bus boycott pin. With careful movements, she unfolded the note and slipped it inside, alongside the pin that carried its own history of quiet resistance. Later that night, in the guest room that always felt like home, Ava lay in bed with her phone in her hands. The screen's blue light illuminated her face as she opened her messages and started typing, "Was that you?" Her thumb hovered over the send button, the message to her father waiting to be delivered. But something made her pause. She thought about the words on the card again. You didn't raise your voice, but you raised a standard. No, those weren't her father's words. Daniel Monroe was direct, practical. He dealt in clear actions and measurable results. He wouldn't wrap truth in poetry like that. Ava pressed delete, watching the words disappear letter by letter. She didn't need to ask. She knew it wasn't him. Her father showed his love through action, through replaced crews and activated oversight positions and systematic changes. He wouldn't hide behind an unsigned note or speak in metaphors about standards being raised. She set her phone on the nightstand and rolled onto her side, looking out the window at the Atlanta night sky. The card was now safely tucked away with the pin, two pieces of history, one old, one new, sharing space in the same envelope, both speaking to the same truth. Sometimes the quietest actions spoke the loudest. Somewhere in the house she could hear Miss Thelma's soft footsteps, probably making her nightly cup of chamomile tea. The familiar sounds of her grandmother's home wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket, but her mind was still on that card. Who had written those words? Someone who had seen her that day. Obviously. Someone who understood what it meant to stay composed in the face of injustice. Someone who recognized that sometimes just existing in a space with dignity was its own form of revolution. Daniel Monroe's office was quiet, except for the soft hum of his computer and the muted city sounds filtering through the thick windows of the Airline Air headquarters. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his polished desk when his private line rang. The caller ID displayed, Marcus Wellington, board member. Daniel picked up on the second ring, his voice steady and professional. Marcus. You removed crew mid-flight without notifying the board? Wellington's tone carried a mix of disbelief and contained anger. That's not standard protocol, Daniel. You know that. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. No, Marcus, I removed risk. His words were measured, each syllable carrying the weight of certainty. The crew demonstrated behavior that exposed our company to significant liability. This is about your daughter. It wasn't a question. This is about any passenger who purchases a ticket and is treated with unfounded suspicion. Daniel's tone remained calm, but carried an edge of steel. The fact that it was my daughter simply meant I saw it firsthand. A heavy silence filled the line before Wellington spoke again. The executive committee is meeting in 30 minutes. Conference room A. We need to discuss this situation. I'll be there, Daniel replied, ending the call without ceremony. The walk to conference room A felt longer than usual. Through the glass walls of the corridor, Daniel could see clusters of executives already gathered, their faces tight with concern. He noticed how conversations stopped as he passed, replaced by careful nods and avoided gazes. Inside the conference room, the tension was palpable. 8 board members sat around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from carefully neutral to openly worried. CEO or not, Daniel knew this wasn't just another meeting. James Harrison, head of legal, spoke first. "Daniel, we understand your personal investment in this situation, but removing crew mid-flight creates significant exposure for us. The optics alone—" "The optics?" Daniel interrupted, his voice still measured but carrying a hint of ice. "Let's discuss optics. How about the optics of a paying first-class passenger being relocated to economy based on appearance? How about the optics of that happening to multiple unaccompanied minors over the past 6 months?" The room fell silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Victoria Chen, head of public relations, cleared her throat. "We're concerned about potential press leaks. If this gets out, the headlines write themselves. CEO's daughter discriminated against on own airline. It could trigger a flood of similar claims, lawsuits. Which is precisely why we need immediate structural change," Daniel interjected. He opened his laptop, turning it to face the room. "I've reviewed our incident reports. This wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern we've been ignoring." The screen displayed a graph showing similar passenger relocation incidents over the past year. The data was clear. There was a disproportionate impact on certain demographics. Wellington leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" Daniel closed his laptop with deliberate care. "I'm willing to compromise on the immediate consequences. No terminations for the crew involved. They'll be transferred to ground operations with mandatory retraining." He paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. "But I'm not compromising on structural change. The passenger bias oversight position I've activated remains permanent, and it reports directly to me." Harrison frowned. "That's a significant amount of autonomous authority, Daniel. The board should have some oversight." "The board will receive quarterly reports," Daniel cut in. "But the position needs independence to be effective. We can't have bias oversight filtered through the same systems that allowed this to happen." The room erupted in murmured discussions. Daniel waited, watching the familiar dance of corporate politics play out. He could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, weighing risk against reputation, liability against leadership. After several minutes of heated debate, Wellington raised his hand for silence. "We'll agree to the transfers and the oversight position, but we need assurance this won't become a public spectacle." "It won't," Daniel replied, "as long as we actually fix the problem instead of just hiding it." The meeting concluded with careful nods and tentative agreements. Daniel waited until the last board member left before making his way back to his office. The sun had set during the meeting, leaving the corridors lit only by fluorescent lights. In his office, Daniel walked to a locked filing cabinet in the corner. The key turned with a soft click, and he pulled out a thick folder marked Article 9 Internal Conduct, Dormant. The pages were slightly yellow with age, carrying the musty smell of unused policy. He sat at his desk, carefully turning pages until he found what he was looking for. Section 3.7 of Article 9 stood out in faded type. Any employee who demonstrates repeat pattern bias without legal grounds may be shadow audited for a period determined by senior management. Daniel reached for a yellow highlighter, marking the clause with a precise line. The policy had never been enforced. It had sat dormant since its creation decades ago, gathering dust like so many other well-intentioned but unused regulations. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes. Ava's incident wouldn't just be documented, it would become the template, the standard against which future incidents would be measured, the baseline for what wouldn't be tolerated. The clause he'd highlighted would give the new oversight officer the tools needed to monitor patterns of behavior without alerting those being watched. It wasn't about catching people. It was about preventing incidents before they happened. The Atlanta airport hummed with its usual Sunday afternoon energy as Ava stood in line at the Oralis airgate. A week had passed since her arrival, a week filled with quiet conversations with Miss Thelma and long walks through neighborhoods where history seemed to seep from every crack in the sidewalk. Now, she was heading home, her backpack slightly heavier with the weight of her grandmother's stories, and that small pin tucked safely inside. The line moved steadily forward. Ava watched as passengers ahead of her presented their boarding passes, some fumbling with phones, others clutching printed tickets. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the counter with the same composed demeanor she'd maintained throughout her stay. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, smiled as Ava approached. There was something different in her manner, not the forced politeness of last week, but genuine warmth. Ava held out her phone, displaying the digital boarding pass. The scanner lit up with a soft green glow, accompanied by a gentle chime that seemed to echo in the quiet terminal. The gate agent's smile widened slightly as she looked at her screen. "Welcome back, Miss Monroe," she said, her voice carrying just the right balance of respect and warmth. Not too familiar, not too distant. Just right. Ava nodded, tucking her phone back into her pocket. The agent gestured toward the jet bridge, and Ava noticed she was being allowed to board ahead of the general first-class queue. No announcement was made about it, just a subtle courtesy extended without fanfare. The jet bridge stretched before her, its accordion walls creating familiar patterns of light and shadow. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the aircraft door. The flight attendant stationed there greeted her with a professional nod, checking her boarding pass with proper attention before directing her inside. The first-class cabin looked exactly as it had a week ago. The same soft leather seats, the same elegant lighting, the same sense of privilege and comfort. But something had shifted. As Ava moved towards seat 1A, she noticed the difference wasn't in the cabin itself, but in how she was perceived within it. Other first-class passengers were already seated, their attention focused on phones or magazines or the windows. No one stared, no one whispered, no one questioned her presence. She was simply another passenger taking her assigned seat. Ava reached 1A and stored her backpack in the overhead compartment, keeping her book out for the flight. As she settled into the familiar window seat, she noticed an envelope placed precisely in the center of her tray table. It was pristine white, unmarked, sealed with the Airline Air logo. She opened it carefully, trying not to tear the edges. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was formal, printed on heavy company letterhead. "Dear Miss Monroe, on behalf of Airline Air, we extend our sincere apologies for the events that occurred on Flight 86 from JFK to ATL on Saturday, August 12th. The actions taken by certain crew members were unacceptable and in direct violation of our service standards and ethical guidelines. We want to assure you that appropriate measures have been taken to address this incident and prevent similar occurrences in the future. Your experience has led to meaningful changes in our training and oversight procedures. We value you as our passenger and are committed to ensuring all travelers receive equal respect and consideration. Sincerely, Victoria Chen, Senior Vice President of Customer Relations, Airline Air." The second paper was different, a handwritten note on Captain's stationery. The handwriting was neat but carried a personal touch. "Miss Monroe, I was the captain on Flight 86 last week. I saw what they did. I should have stopped it sooner. I won't let it happen again. Respectfully, Captain James Mitchell." Ava read both notes twice, her expression unchanged. Her fingers traced the edge of the captain's note before she reached for her backpack. She unzipped it carefully and slipped both papers inside, next to the envelope containing her grandmother's pin. Her hand lingered on the zipper for a moment, gripping it slightly tighter than necessary, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. The cabin continued to fill around her. A businessman took the seat beside her with nothing more than a polite, "Good afternoon." The woman in 2A simply opened her laptop and began typing. The normality of it all carried its own kind of weight. Just before the main cabin door closed, Ava glanced down the aisle out of habit. Her eyes found Eloise in economy, same as before, though this time in row 24 instead of 26. The older woman was already watching, her gaze carrying the same sharp clarity it had held a week ago. Ava's hand moved slightly, lifting the edge of her backpack where she'd stored the envelope. It was barely a gesture, more of an acknowledgement than a movement, but Eloise caught it, responding with a single, definitive nod. In that brief exchange, volumes were spoken without a word being uttered. The understanding that passed between them needed no elaboration. They both knew what the envelope represented. Not just an apology, but a marker of change. Not just words on paper, but evidence that someone had been watching, someone had acted, someone had cared enough to make sure it wouldn't happen again. The late afternoon sun filtered through JFK's terminal windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors as Ava made her way through the familiar corridors. Her carry-on bag rolled smoothly behind her, its wheels creating a steady rhythm against the tile. She felt lighter somehow, more grounded after her week with Miss Thelma, even with the weight of everything that had happened. The terminal was busy with its usual mix of travelers, business people rushing between gates, families corralling children and luggage, airline staff moving with practiced efficiency through the crowds. Ava navigated through them all with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout her return flight. As she approached the main terminal junction where she would turn toward the arrivals hall, something caught her attention. Through the large windows of a nearby gate, she could see a regional jet being prepared for departure to Chicago. It was a smaller aircraft than the one she'd just left, but it wore the same Auralis air colors. Ava slowed her pace, then stopped completely. There, behind the gate desk, stood Ms. Carter. She was exactly as Ava remembered from that morning a week ago. Crisp uniform, perfectly styled hair, practiced professional smile as she checked boarding passes. She moved with the same confident efficiency, spoke with the same measured tone to passengers approaching her counter. Nothing about her suggested any awareness of what she had done, any hint that her actions had triggered an investigation that reached the highest levels of the airline. She was still here, still in uniform, still representing Auralis Air. For a moment, Ava stood perfectly still, her hand tightening almost imperceptibly on the handle of her carry-on. She watched Ms. Carter process another passenger, checking documents with the same scrutiny she had applied to Ava's boarding pass that day. The same movements, the same smile, the same authority in her gestures. Then, as if sensing she was being watched, Ms. Carter looked up. Her eyes met Ava's across the terminal. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Ava didn't move, didn't change her expression. She simply held Ms. Carter's gaze, neither challenging nor retreating. She was simply present, impossible to ignore or dismiss. It was Ms. Carter who broke first. Her eyes slid away, returning to her computer screen as if Ava were just another face in the crowd. There was no flash of recognition in her expression, no hint of remorse or discomfort. Her face remained neutral, professional, focused on her tasks. She continued checking in passengers as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't tried to remove a legitimate passenger from their rightful seat based on nothing but appearance. Ava waited another moment, watching. Some part of her had expected something. An acknowledgement, perhaps, or a flicker of shame, maybe even an apology, though she hadn't really believed that would come. But there was nothing. Just the same practiced movements, the same professional distance, the same authority wielded without reflection. Drawing a steady breath, Ava adjusted her grip on her carry-on bag. She turned away from the gate, wheels rolling smoothly as she resumed her path toward the arrivals hall. Her steps were neither hurried nor hesitant. She moved with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. The arrivals hall opened before her, its high ceiling and broad windows creating a sense of space after the confined airplane cabin. Among the waiting crowd, she spotted her father immediately. Daniel Monroe stood slightly apart from the other greeters, his dark jacket and straight posture making him easy to identify. He held a coffee cup in one hand, his phone in the other, but his attention was focused on the exit where passengers emerged. When he saw Ava, his expression softened slightly. Not quite a smile, but a warming of his usually composed features. He tucked his phone away as she approached. "Good flight?" he asked, his tone casual but attentive. Ava adjusted her backpack strap. "Better," she replied simply. They fell into step together, moving through the terminal without further conversation. Daniel didn't press for details about the flight or her stay with Miss Thelma. Ava didn't volunteer any information about the formal apology letter or the captain's note tucked away in her bag. They simply walked, father and daughter, their silence comfortable, but weighted with shared understanding. As they approached the parking area where their car waited, Ava spoke again. Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying no particular emotion. "She's still working." Daniel's stride didn't break, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tightening of his shoulders, a slight change in his jaw. He didn't respond immediately, taking a moment to process this information with the same careful consideration he applied to all significant decisions. Then, his voice equally measured, "Not for long." The morning light filtered through Ava's bedroom window, casting soft shadows across her desk, where the collection of papers and pins from the past week lay carefully arranged. The formal apology letter from Airline Air sat beside her algebra textbook, its crisp corporate letterhead a stark contrast to the worn edges of Miss Thelma's boycott pin envelope. The handwritten notes, from the captain, from the mysterious supporter, were tucked safely inside, each one a testament to the quiet revolution that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Ava sat cross-legged on her bed, already dressed for school but not quite ready to head downstairs. Her eyes kept drifting to the items on her desk. A week ago, they had been just another passenger in seat 1A. Now each object carried the weight of something larger, something that stretched beyond a single flight or a single incident. She moved to her desk and picked up the boycott pin, turning it over in her hands. The metal was smooth from years of handling, its surface holding decades of history. Miss Thelma's words echoed in her mind. "Pass it to the next girl in seat 1A." Ava had nodded then, but now she truly understood. This wasn't about one seat or one flight. It was about making sure the next girl wouldn't have to fight the same battle. In his home office downstairs, Daniel Monroe sat at his desk, his posture relaxed but purposeful as he addressed the faces on his screen. The Airline executive team filled the grid of his video conference, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern as he outlined his plans. "The Passenger Bias Oversight Office isn't temporary," Daniel stated, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "In fact, we're expanding its scope." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This isn't about damage control. It's about systematic change." A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their virtual squares. One began to speak, but Daniel continued smoothly. "I'm also announcing the creation of a new scholarship fund," he said, clicking through to a presentation slide. 5 full scholarships annually, targeting underrepresented youth interested in aviation careers. The fund will be private, independent of corporate budgets. His mouse hovered over the scholarship's name, the Seat 1A Initiative. The silence on the call was heavy with understanding. Everyone knew about Flight 86. Everyone knew whose daughter had sat in Seat 1A. But Daniel never mentioned Ava's name, never leveraged her experience directly. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't about protecting his child. It was about protecting every child who would follow. "One final item," Daniel continued, his tone unchanged. "Regarding Ms. Carter," the executives leaned forward slightly, anticipating the expected termination announcement. "She'll be reassigned to customer relations, back office." He pulled up another document. "Her primary responsibility will be reviewing every discrimination case reported in the last 3 years. Every complaint, every incident, every misunderstanding that was quietly resolved." The faces on screen registered various degrees of surprise. This wasn't the punitive firing they'd expected. This was something else. A lesson wrapped in an assignment, a chance for understanding wrapped in accountability. As the meeting concluded, Daniel sent out the official directives. Each one was carefully worded, legally sound, but carried an unmistakable message. Airline Air was changing, not because of public pressure or legal threats, but because someone had finally looked closely at what had always been there. Later that afternoon, as Ava worked on her homework, a knock at her bedroom door interrupted her concentration. Their housekeeper entered with a sleek black envelope bearing the Airline Air logo in silver. "Special delivery for you, Miss Ava," she said, placing it on the desk. Ava waited until she was alone before opening the envelope. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a pin. Not like the worn metal of Miss Thelma's boycott memento, but something new, black enamel trimmed in gold, elegant but understated. 2 words were engraved in clear, simple text: Seat 1A. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry or a corporate gesture. This was a marker, a symbol of something that had started with her but wouldn't end with her. She thought about Ms. Carter, now sitting in a back office reading through years of stories like hers. She thought about the future scholarship recipients who would never know her name, but would carry forward the change she had helped create. Carefully, Ava opened her desk drawer and took out the envelope containing Miss Thelma's boycott pin. She placed the new Seat 1A pin beside it, then sealed them both away together. 2 pins, separated by decades but united in purpose. 2 stories of quiet resistance, of dignity maintained in the face of prejudice. The same fight, fought in different ways, but with the same unwavering resolve. The drawer closed with a soft click. Ava returned to her homework, but something had shifted in her posture, in the way she held herself. She was no longer just responding to what had happened to her. She was part of something larger now, something that would continue long after Flight 86 was forgotten. She was choosing her own way forward, carrying both pins' weight with the quiet strength that had become her own form of revolution. 2 months after the incident on Flight 86, Ava Monroe stood at Gate C4 at JFK, her debate team jacket crisp against her shoulders. The royal blue fabric with gold trim marked her as part of Riverside Prep's championship debate squad, but it was her posture that truly set her apart. In the 2 months since that first flight to Atlanta, something had shifted in her bearing. Not just physical growth, but a quiet certainty that seemed to radiate from within. The gate agent smiled as Ava approached, her boarding pass ready. The scanner beeped with a familiar green light, and the agent's voice carried a note of recognition. "Welcome aboard, Miss Monroe." Ava nodded, accepting the greeting with the same composed demeanor she'd maintained since that day in July. She walked down the jet bridge, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. The sound of its wheels against the corrugated floor echoed in the narrow passage, marking her steady progress toward the aircraft door. The first-class cabin gleamed with its usual polish. Leather seats, wood accents, the subtle glow of reading lights. Seat 1A waited for her, just as it had before, just as it always would. Ava stored her bag in the overhead compartment with practiced ease, settled into her seat, and began her usual pre-flight routine. Book out, phone on airplane mode, seatbelt fastened. The cabin slowly filled with its typical first-class crowd, executives with pressed suits, wealthy travelers in designer casual wear, the occasional celebrity trying to remain incognito. But it was the sound of small footsteps that caught Ava's attention. A young Latina girl, no more than 10, stepped into the first-class cabin alongside her father. She wore a pink backpack covered in butterfly patches and gripped her father's hand tightly. As they moved down the aisle, the girl's eyes locked onto Ava, growing wide with surprise and something that looked like recognition. "She's a kid like me, Dad," the girl whispered, loud enough for Ava to hear. The father, dressed in a business casual outfit that spoke of Silicon Valley success, offered an awkward smile in Ava's direction, but said nothing. He guided his daughter to their seats a few rows back, but Ava could feel the girl's occasional glances forward. Ava didn't wave. She didn't turn around or acknowledge the attention. Instead, she sat exactly as she was, poised, unbothered, present. Her existence in Seat 1A was neither a statement nor a question. It was simply a fact, as natural as the clouds outside her window. The flight progressed smoothly through takeoff and into cruise altitude. Ava alternated between reading her book and reviewing debate notes for the upcoming competition. The cabin service moved with professional efficiency, the crew treating her with the same courteous respect they showed every first-class passenger. Halfway through the flight, as the sun began its westward descent, a flight attendant approached with what appeared to be a routine cabin check. She paused at Ava's seat, placing a carefully folded napkin on her tray table. The movement was smooth, practiced, almost unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't watching closely. Ava waited until the attendant had moved on before unfolding the napkin. Inside, a typed note lay perfectly centered on the white paper. "The system is watching now, and it started with you." The message wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Ava refolded the napkin precisely along its original creases and tucked it into her jacket pocket, right next to where the Seat 1A pin rested against the fabric. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. As the plane touched down at LAX, passengers began their usual rush to deplane, eager to escape into the Southern California sunshine. Ava stayed seated, watching as the cabin slowly emptied. The young girl and her father passed by, the girl stealing one final glance in Ava's direction. When the last passenger had gone, Ava stood, retrieved her bag, and made her way toward the exit. The jet bridge stretched before her, its walls close and gray. She had taken only a few steps when a voice called out softly, "Excuse me?" A junior flight attendant stood to the side, her hands clasped nervously in front of her uniform. She was young, black, and her eyes held a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. "Hey," the attendant began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say, we all saw what you did. Quiet or not, it changed things." Ava met the attendant's gaze and offered a small, knowing smile. She nodded once, an acknowledgement of shared understanding, and then continued walking. Her steps were measured and confident, neither hurrying nor dawdling. The pin in her jacket pocket pressed lightly against her chest with each step, a silent reminder of its presence. But she didn't need to show it, not anymore. In the 2 months since Flight 86, word had spread through the airline's corridors and cabins. Everyone knew about Seat 1A. Everyone knew about the girl who had changed things without raising her voice. Everyone knew about the quiet revolution that had started with a single passenger refusing to be moved. Ava walked forward, her debate team jacket catching the California sunlight as she emerged from the jet bridge. There was no spotlight, no fanfare, no dramatic gesture. Just the steady movement of power and motion, as natural as breathing, as unstoppable as time. If you enjoyed the story of Ava, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.